Big 3rd District Congressman Frank Lucas. How you doing this morning, my friend?
I am having a glorious time here in the nation's capital. It's summertime in D.C., so the humidity number and the temperature number are the same. It is a swamp, and that's why prior to air conditioning, everybody packed up in this town and went home on the 4th of July, which, by the way, would be in the best interest of the nation to this day if I could persuade the people I work with to get their work done on time.
Before we talk about what you have going on in Congress, you said the Senate's taking up health care again today?
Absolutely. That's the rumor. They will have a procedural vote to decide how to proceed. Now, whether it'll be a complete repeal, I don't know, or a repeal and replace, I don't know. Whether they will take up the language that the House passed before we went home for the 4th of July, I don't know. But it is my understanding they're going to attempt to start moving forward on this over there. And we're in the House basically at a standstill until they do something in the Senate, because we did our work before we went home for the 4th of July. The president's pushing on them hard. President Trump is. And we'll see what happens in that body of 100.
We don't have any idea, though, what's going to come out of today, the meetings today or the votes today?
I do not. I just know that if we're ever going to address this mess, they've got to take action, because in the legislative process, we need for them to take action so we can respond. And we're, at least on health care in the House, at a standstill until they move forward.
So you made mention before we went on here this morning, the Made in America week. Captain and I were talking about this last week as it was kind of going on and running down some of the stuff that was being displayed in the nation's capital. I had no idea that Ditch Witch was made in Oklahoma. I do now. It's kind of cool. But what was the experience like? What was it all about?
Well, I was invited to the White House twice last week because it was Made in America week, and of course the president's campaign theme was Make America Great Again, so Made in America seems to be a perfect fit. The first time I went up, yes, Monday, was because Ditch Witch was a part of a display of American products made there. The president addressed the folks who had come for that and the press. Ditch Witch, just for a side note, Perry, Oklahoma, was started by the Malzahn family, is still owned by the Malzahn family, and they originally, about 100 years ago, were blacksmiths in Perry, Oklahoma, horseshoes and repairing wagons and working on plow parts and that sort of stuff. And they came up with the design back, I think, in the 1930s or 40s for the original trencher, perfected the design, set up a factory, and they're sold worldwide. So it is an amazing Oklahoma company started by just a bunch of Oklahoma blacksmiths almost a century ago to get to this point. The second time I went up was another focus on Made in America products, and the Blank Slate Coaster folks from Stillwater, Oklahoma, had been invited. They make these coasters that have a porous design so that if you set your glass down on them and the glass sweats, say your bottle of soda pop in the humid summertime, so to speak, the coaster absorbs the moisture and keeps it off the surface. And they will print designs on them, anything you want. The company had been making about 200,000 of these a year in recent years, but 3 or 4 months ago, they persuaded Walmart Corporation that their product was of a high enough quality that it should be sold as a part of their Made in America program in the stores. So now they're gearing up to make 200,000 a month.
No, that's cool.
A 12 times increase. But again, a company in the district in Oklahoma where folks came up with a good idea, put it together, and went forward. Now, at that, the second one, where the coaster people were, the president had a roundtable to discuss what we should be doing, what the focus was. But I will tell you, in both circumstances, the thing I took away from the White House was President Trump, in small crowds or in private crowds, is the same guy he is on TV. So anyone who thinks that President Trump puts up a show when he's on camera, that's just the intense personality, the straightforward, say exactly what you think kind of guy he is. Has a pretty good lesson in that this week.
Out of Oklahoma, what's the coolest product that you ran into that maybe you didn't know was made in America, or just something?
There was a small group of products on both days I were there, on Monday and on Wednesday. Anyone who's ever dug a ditch with a shovel knows that Ditch Witch is the most wonderful thing in the world. I mean, that trencher is awesome. Now, the coasters I had seen, but I'd never really been in a humid place like the East Coast, where the old boy demonstrated to the president and all of us his product. But it worked really well, too. And there's just all sorts of stuff going on. You remember, in Oklahoma, not only is there a focus on Made in America, but we have a focus on Made in Oklahoma products,
right,
which you'll see in the stores or shelves with that logo, Made in Oklahoma. So my point to the president was on the second opportunity up, when we reclaim our markets here at home, and that's what Made in America is all about, is persuading our neighbors to buy products made in the United States, then the focus, again, has to be aggressively, how do we sell our Made in America products into the world and reclaim all that? So it was a positive experience, but if you've never been to the White House before, and the gentleman from the Coaster Company had never been in D.C. before, so if you've never been in the nation's capital, and your first time you come to a meeting set down in the East Room of the White House with 40 or so other entrepreneurs, with the President of the United States and 20 TV cameras and a legion of press, he had an excited look in his eyes.
Oh, yeah, I would imagine.
You couldn't help but know the guy was pretty fired up.
So you recently signed off on a letter with a couple of colleagues talking about livestock hauling. I guess some don't understand that it's not good to haul livestock across the country and take 2 weeks to do it. But kind of give us the long and short of this regulatory relief livestock hauling letter that you sent.
Basically, the long and the short is it would give 2 more years before the rules are fully implemented, and it focuses on trying to be practical in how you do this process. You got to move livestock. I mean, of all the places in the world in the southwest United States where beef, where pork, where live product, you got to move them, whether it's from the sale barns to the wheat pasture, from the wheat pasture to the feedlots, and the feedlots to the packing plants. Let's just make sure everybody has time to make the adjustments to what they need to do to be able to do this. And of course, very sensitive. I think my colleagues on the Ag Committee, and I know my fellow members of Congress out in rural areas, very sensitive about how we handle livestock, because we always need to have the support of the public. There are groups out there who don't necessarily like animal protein, so to speak, and anything that could bring the industry to an end basically would bring them great delight. So basically this is just to give our producers a little more time to adjust, and now that we have different people running the agencies, maybe a little better focus on what's practical and what's not.
So,
with the interest of the livestock at heart, of course.
Can you give us some of the regulations that they're looking to impose, and what you're hoping to maybe stop the implementation of?
On a variety of things. Well, we passed like 13 repeal bills undoing stuff that the Obama folks wanted to do initially. The one thing we were not successful in, because the Senate couldn't manage to get the votes together, dealt with methane on oil and gas location sites. Anybody that's ever been near a gas well or an old oil well knows that there's a certain amount of I guess you'd call it fumes, a certain amount of gas that leaks through all the connections and comes out. And the Obama folks, who, by the way, not only didn't like coal, but didn't like oil or natural gas, were trying to use that as a way to clamp down on the production, because if you can't meet these standards that are unreasonable, then you can't drill the wells. Can't drill the wells, then you don't have the product. If you don't have the product, then the price goes up. And by driving up the price of gasoline and everything else that comes out of natural gas, of course, then you reduce consumer consumption. So if they couldn't pass a law to say that you needed to spend a warmer summer in your house, then you run up the cost of the electricity by running up the cost of the inputs, and you force people to live in a warmer house in the summer or a colder house in the wintertime. That is one of the things about switching from President Obama to President Trump. President Obama seemed to be very focused on micromanaging everything in our lives. President Obama was very focused on managing everything in our lives. President Trump seems to understand that we have to be responsible and get on about our business and do things and make things happen. So that's a positive change.
The House recently passed the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018. Funding our nation's military sets our defense priorities for the year to come. You want to comment?
Absolutely. This is the annual authorization bill that tells the military what they could do with the money that they'll get in the appropriations process. This year it's different than previous years because basically it calls for an increase in troop pay by 2.4%. If we're going to have a voluntary military, we've got to pay people. I'm old enough, I remember the draft. I know there are supporters of draft around, but I personally believe you should want to defend the country. You should want to be in the services. You should want to make it a career. You shouldn't be forced to, so paying them decently. It also boosts the number of active personnel in the branches by about 18,000 troops, a little over a division, but that would be spread out across the services. It calls for additional planes. There's a few more ships in it, but it's basically trying to respond to the threat from the potential threat from the mainland Chinese, what the folks are doing, the madman's doing in North Korea, and the Russian mischief going on around the world too. So it's an effort to say, no, in the world we live in, it's not safer, so you can't spend less. You got to be better prepared to defend yourself, because after all, the ultimate responsibility of Congress under the Constitution is to defend the Republic. And you can't defend your Republic if you can't defend yourself. So.
Congress is getting ready to take on the task of passing spending legislation to keep the government open and raising the national debt ceiling. I guess you guys got to start tackling this here pretty soon, right? I guess.
It's about what it looks like is about a 4-stage process here. We're going to, I'm actually in about 5 minutes going to a House Republican Members Conference where we will discuss how to proceed on the appropriation bills. There's 12 individual appropriation bills. There was a proposal a couple of weeks ago to put them all into basically one big bill, have an open amendment process. So you're probably talking 200, 300, 400 amendments being filed. But an open process, pass them en masse, send them over the Senate. A number of my colleagues couldn't bring themselves to agree to move the thing along in an orderly fashion. So then the next proposal was, well, let's take the defense-related, the military appropriations, the veterans, military construction, those kind of things, and move them this week. Now some of my other friends have woke up a little bit and realized that, hey, it's the end of July, the new bookkeeping year starts October 1, let's move them en masse. That's what we're going to talk about this morning. I personally hope with an open process, an appropriate number of amendments, we move them en masse and get done in an orderly time on funding. From there, then the question will become, what do we do with the budget resolution? Because that's the annual bill that outlines how you're supposed to spend your money. It's important this time because it will provide instructions for tax reform, which is something I think we'll launch into in September. And mixed in there probably in September, October, is the question about raising the debt ceiling. Now, remember, the debt ceiling is not to fund spending going forward. It's covering the checks that have already been written. So I always remind my colleagues, if you don't want to vote for the debt ceiling, then you shouldn't vote for the appropriation bills because you're spending the money that the debt ceiling is to cover. Now, we'll see how all that sorts out, but that's the big things left to do as we go into the fall is fund the federal government, do the budget resolution to make it possible to move to tax reform, address the debt ceiling, and then the Speaker, his greatest personal focus, is tax reform, and that's a big old full agenda.
It seems like the debt ceiling gets raised about every 6 months. I don't understand how that kind of weighs out, because you spend the money, you raise the ceiling.
It's called the Gephardt rule, where when they passed a budget resolution that spelled out what would be needed to cover past spending, basically they just automatically raised it. When we took control in 1995, we changed that to say, no, instead of kind of rolling it through in the middle of the night, let's just publicly stand up and do our responsible thing, whatever that may be.
So one more just for fun before we let you go. I know you got to go. Earlier in the summer, the Democrats, their slogan or their campaign was a summer of rage or whatever it was. Now they rolled out another rebranding campaign yesterday called A Better Deal. Is this
all the TV coverage of it? I thought it was fascinating. They went out into Virginia. They took off their ties, stood in the sun and sweated a little bit.
Yeah.
To show that they were like real folks. They didn't mention national health care. They didn't mention the border. They didn't mention a whole bunch of stuff. But it is fascinating that they've come to realize that just bashing Donald Trump isn't going to get them back into power. They have to start to try to show they care about real people. We'll see how successful they are. But then, that's why I come home every weekend. That's why I do 32 town meetings. That's why I live in Oklahoma. It's because those are the folks we're supposed to listen to. The leadership of the party, Speaker Pelosi and that crowd, and Chuck Schumer over on the Senate side on the Democrats, they're trying to rebrand.
So you're
get it done. Many of our listeners won't remember New Coke, but it didn't work either.
Your campaign slogan, whenever you come out, going to be a better deal? I got a better deal. I one-upped you. I got a better deal.
I will talk to you later.